Hello and welcome to Increased Transparency, Increased Liability for Designers. This is a webcast hosted by Building Green. My name is Tristan Roberts. I'm Editorial Director for Building Green. Thank you for joining us today. Now I'm going to introduce our panel. First, I want to thank them so much for just being with us today. This is a very distinguished panel. They volunteered their time to help sort through some issues that are coming up that I think a lot of designers and firms are dealing with. Some firms have pretty high-powered legal counsel, and we've brought some of those guys on today, and some don't. But we're all looking at these questions. So with us today is Russell Perry. He's a Vice President and DC Office Director for Smith Group JJR. Now, Russell, of course, isn't a lawyer, but he's here to offer a perspective as an architect. And we're also joined today, and also from Smith Group JJR is Bart Stassa. He's the Chief Legal Officer there. We have Craig Williams, who's an architect and Chief Legal Officer and Senior Vice President for HKS. We have Brody Stevens, who's a lead AP and General Counsel for Perkins & Will. And we have Richard Victoria, who's Chief Legal Officer for Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And now I'm going to hand it off to Russell Perry, who's going to give us an quick introduction to the overall topic. Russ?
Thanks, Tristan. When we talk about material transparency and disclosure, we're referring to the industry trajectory toward better communication between manufacturers, designers, owners, and users on the composition of building materials. We've come a long way since the initial requirements of the lead pilot in 1999 that called for disclosure of VOC emissions and adhesives, paints, and sealants as the only interface with material chemistry. Today, of course, Declare, Cradle to Cradle, the new V4 credits on material disclosure and optimization begin to sketch the outlines of a much more interesting and challenging landscape of communications across the industry. The Health Product Declaration, or the HPD, is emerging as the common tool to simplify this communication. Many of us have been working hard to discover the right tools and incentives so that designers can fulfill what some of us feel is a responsibility to understand what specifically we are putting into buildings. But having access to this information may come with risk and exposure. So today we've invited leading counselors from the AE side of the industry to help us understand the emerging issues for designers. With some initial thoughts, I'd like to introduce Brody Stevens, the General Counsel for Perkins & Will.
Yeah, hi, Russ. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity. I just wanted to kick off the conversation with some thoughts that the other chief legal officers and myself kicked around prior to this call. You know, health product declarations are relatively new, even though they are similar in form to other earlier types of declarations, such as the material safety data sheets or the environmental product disclosures. These new declarations, or this new declaration, is going to be used probably in new ways, or could be used in new ways, such as the specification of materials or products or advisory services that our firms may engage in and deliver to our clients, which are related or to discuss reported health impacts of substances found in materials and products. And because this is so new, there's really no standard of care as such that has been developed related to these activities. There's no case law, there's no regulation related to the use of HPDs, and there really are no best industry practices that can be cited or relied upon. And so our conversation today will, by necessity, be just a conversation. We're all just beginning to think about how our businesses could be affected, much less how liabilities may arise out of the existence and use of HPDs. Nothing any of us has to say today can be construed as legal advice. It's too general and too preliminary, and none of the listeners to this call are our clients. So we're not going to be dispensing legal advice, but we are going to be having a discussion that we hope to sparks further conversations with the hearers, advisors, and within the practices of our own firms and the folks that are listening in.
Well, thank you, Brody. Thanks, Russ, for getting us started. I'm going to just start with, I think, the biggest question that is on the mind of a lot of people. And I'll open it up to anyone on the panel that wants to jump in. Just please introduce yourselves when you speak. So HPDs and other tools include details about a product's ingredients and potential health hazards associated with those ingredients. Does asking for and receiving this kind of ingredient disclosure on products under consideration expose a designer or a design firm to additional liability?
Well, this is Brody. I think the answer to that, not even the answer, I think the question about that is what whether or not there's going to be liability is unknown. What is known is that this information is new again, and it may not be available to or consumed by the persons that are going to be affected by the information. So the information may be available, but the folks who might be affected by that information may not be our clients directly. They might be downstream purchasers or lessees of a building or invitees to a building. So the question is going to be, if this information is available, can a potential risk be mitigated by just a disclosure, like a Prop 65 requirement when you walk down the jetway and you see the little sign that says jet fuel is bad for you? Or is it something that's going to have more substantive duties associated with that? Do the intermediaries, the owners, the clients, the architects, the constructors have a duty associated with this new information, or at least this information which is newly going to be made available on a consistent basis? Is an open question.
So, Brody, are you suggesting that architects and designers that are specifically asking for and having direct access to this information might be in more of a position to be looking out for the end users of a building, the occupants, the owner, because of their direct engagement? They might have a greater burden to be responsible for the implications of these disclosures.
Well, perhaps and perhaps not. The architect is not the owner of the building that is going to be occupied. The architect is not the person or party that's going to be most responsible for the safety of or health of occupants of a building. The architect is going to have a limited amount of information, and that is going to be third-party entities are going to have provided information about generalized health impacts of substances which are in a product, and the architect can only, within its own professional capacity, act upon that information. Now, if there are agreements that architects make with their clients about what they're going to do for those clients in relation to this information, protect the client against liabilities that arise out of the professional services rendered by the architect, or if the architect makes a statement that some party relies upon, potentially to their detriment, then there is the potential for liability. But it is pretty attenuated so far, and there should be contractual ways to limit that risk.
Okay, thanks, Brody. Bart, Craig, Dick, do you want to offer your take on this general question about whether there might be increased liability to a designer or a design firm here?
This is Dick. Thank you very much, Tristan and Brody, for those comments. I think the audience would be interested to expand this question a bit through the medium of the contract that they sign with the client. For here is often the extent of liability to which you expose yourself as a professional. And it is not uncommon in such contracts for a term to describe that the architect engineer will not be specifying products which are known to be toxic, hazardous, or unsafe in some way. And there are many contracts in which that is a standardized term, particularly governmental contracts. That being said, you have to understand the extent to which that obligation becomes a duty, as Brody was describing it. The more that the specification process takes over from the contract term regarding disclosure of product safety, the more liability follows closely upon its heels. The issue in specification is often, in my view, one between prescriptive versus performance specification. The more one goes into the area of prescriptive specification under the CSI standards, the more difficult it is and the more risky it is from a liability point of view to be getting into specification of products to which you have more and more knowledge about their toxicity, hazardous nature, or safety. And that is an issue that I think everyone should be well aware of, and at least in our experience, the specification process is one that needs to be closely controlled from a contractual and from a practice point of view when your technical architects and engineers start to examine the products that the designers wish to utilize on a project.
Thanks, Dick. Bart or Craig, do you want to weigh in with sort of an opening take on this overall question?
So this is Bart Sassa, and Dick, thank you, and Brody for that. I guess I'm sitting here wondering aloud about those instances, and Brody was kind enough to share a recent item of this with us on as an example. What does the panel think about something along the lines of the single-ply roof membrane with the adhesive that has, that's a winter-grade adhesive, so it would have the solvents in it, and it makes people sick in the building. Let's say the architect had knowledge that the building was going to be occupied at the time. I'm sure there are some attorneys out there that would represent the people getting sick that would argue that the architect had a duty to inform at least the owner, at the very least, that these solvents were present. And I'm curious how Dick would perceive that. What is your thoughts on that one, based upon what your previous statement was, Dick?
Well, I think, Bart, that the answer lies in the contract. Again, did you assume or undertake, either directly or indirectly, any duties regarding the specification of that product and a disclosure of its propensities?
Let's say it was performance-based. Let's say you just spec as that one case did. It was just a single-plied roof membrane from a manufacturer, and it had to be used a winter-grade solvent because of the climate, as opposed to summer-grade. So it had these chemicals in there that could make people sick. And I guess you're always faced with, well, what else could you use? I mean, I guess tar is another thing you could use, but that would make you sick as well. So my thoughts are there's a pull. Even though it depends on the contractual language, you're also pulled by available products. And then it brings it back down to, well, should you have told the owner that this was present? Should the owner have known, and do you have an obligation to do that? Specifically, that language that you specified, or you indicated, I've seen that in a lot of contracts as well, that the architect shall not specify known hazardous materials. Now here you used a performance-based spec that actually had chemicals in it that had hazardous contents to it.
Bart, did the knowledge of the existence of the product come from the information that was supplied on the MSDS sheets of the manufacturer, or did the contractor, as very often is the case, supply an alternate equal for value engineering purposes, which is a different product type than you specified?
That's a good question. I think all of us would advocate here that we should not be reviewing or approving MSDOS sheets, and probably the same mentality might be used as it relates to these HPD declarations. We would use HPD declarations a little bit different to help inform us on what to specify, but in this case, let's say it wasn't a VE thing. Let's say it was a performance-based spec, and we listed 3 manufacturers, and we wanted a winter-grade adhesive, and winter-grade, because of the climate, it has these solvents in it. So even though we may have not specified the exact component to adhere the roof, because of the manufacturer we said was acceptable, and this is the single-ply membrane they use, we indirectly said that this was okay.
Yeah, I think we need to, let that particular instance, which ended up in favor of the engineer after they'd spent many hundreds of thousands of dollars in defense, was about MSDS sheets and workers on the roof claiming that they'd had adverse health impacts associated with that. How the entity that's responsible for worker safety is the employer. The AIA standard agreements for years have disclaimed liability for worker safety, this.
Pardon me, Brody. I was stepping beyond that. I was saying it was actually the employees in the building that were working in there, and we had. I was changing the facts somewhat from what was presented in that paper.
Well, let's use formaldehyde outgassing from carpet or
right.
Interior panel or something like that.
Correct, and I guess the question now is how are we, by requesting this HPD information, how are we intending on using it, and does that extend our standard of care, our liability to it, and using these different scenarios we're speaking through? We all understand MSDOS sheets and what we should or should not do, but does that, by asking for this information, are we now increasing our standard of care? And I think some of us are of the opinion that right now, it's early on, as you said, Brody. It's early on here. It all depends on how we're using them and what is the industry eventually moving to or migrating to as to what is a normal architect supposed to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Dick has well said, a lot of this has to do with really what's in the contract, at least vis-a-vis the owner and potentially vis-a-vis third parties, depending on how the indemnities and limitations of liability in that contract could potentially be struck.
But we've all seen a slip and fall where you can't control yourself from a third party, where a third party in a building says, well, the floor that you specified in the shower didn't have the right coefficient of friction, and I fell and injured myself. So sure, there's an action against the owner, but in some jurisdictions, he may be a foreseeable plaintiff as well to the architect. So, saying merely looking at the contract will limit us, I guess if you have some indemnity from the owner, I guess that's true, but it may not be true in all circumstances.
This is Craig Williams. Let me add another thought. Let me ask another question. The product itself that we're talking about has certain elements, certain characteristics that won't change just because we ask for the information, the HPD information. So I'm struggling with the concept of the product is there, it's not changing, it has certain characteristics. If I don't ask for the information, it still has those same characteristics. So I haven't increased my liability exposure by not asking according to the way practice is done today. So if we move the next step and say, okay, well, now we're going to ask for the information, how does that increase our liability exposure? And one way it could is be careful what you ask for, the concept of once you get it, then you have to know what to do with it. So my concern is, let's say we ask for the information and we get a list of elements or chemicals in a product, then what? How do we deal with that? So, and that I can't answer that because I don't believe most architects, or maybe no architects, have the knowledge, experience, and training to know what to do with it.
Craig,
I don't know.
this is Russ. I'd take that that question one step further. Once someone in your firm asks for the information and the manufacturer complies with it and posts it on their website, do all of us now have an obligation to understand how to use that information?
And the answer to that is probably yes, at some point. Maybe not today, if it's just a few, but as the issue develops, then yes, that will become the standard of care.
Craig, this is Dick again. Can I raise another point here, which expands a bit on that one that you raised? Yeah, I don't know if it's within our purview to go without the borders of the United States, but let me raise it since many of the audience are probably dealing in the international sector, as are all of us on the panel. And there are several instances overseas where this is advanced from a regulatory point of view substantially further than we've been discussing it in the United States. Specifically, I will cite the UK and Australia, which are similar jurisdictions in that regard. There is a statute in the UK known as the CDM, the Construction and Design Management Regulations, which has a corresponding regulation called the Work Health and Safety Act in Australia. And under these statutes, the architect engineer is responsible for substantially more information gathering and safety related duty than the U.S. regulations generally provide. And this may be insightful from the point of view of a precursor to what is coming in the U.S. There is also, as I'm sure many of you know, what is called a collateral warranty in the U.K., which provides a 12-year responsibility for the design. And the risk and the identification and reduction of risks and hazards relating to health and safety, which goes not only to the specification of product, but also during the construction process for protecting workers on the site and for maintenance of the project after it's constructed, is the responsibility that the architect engineer has under these regulations. And if similar things start to find their way into the U.S., as we understand they will be before too long, then the tables will turn slightly, albeit Craig and I were both trial lawyers, so we're thinking of it more in terms of probably of the litigation aspect of it, but from the regulatory aspect, the European sector is behind us from the litigation side, but ahead of us on the regulatory side in this respect. So I just wanted to throw into the mix the fact that regulations in the European Union have already moved substantially further in this regard.
Well, if I can pose a question that I think builds on this, and maybe from a more, this wouldn't be my point of view, but the voice of question that might be out there is, isn't, if we don't request disclosure of ingredients and we sort of don't look too hard at what's in these products, don't do the HPDs, and providing our contract language fits with that, isn't it easier to argue that the manufacturer or someone else other than the designer is responsible for the product contents and their health impacts?
Well, you still, first of all, whether or not somebody is more or less responsible may not really be an answer that is particularly helpful to the design professionals. That is to say, if the design professional has a duty, and whether that duty is a contractual duty, or it's a common law duty, or it's a regulatory duty, and then the design professional does not reasonably discharge that duty by its performance or by taking some action or giving some warning, then the design professional is going to have liability. The fact that the manufacturer may also have liability, or even may have more substantive liability, doesn't necessarily mean that the design professional has no liability, if that's your question.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer to the question that I posed.
Yeah, I think the issue there is, If the information is not published and not available, then what liability exposure does the design professional have for the contents of those products? And history and current law says, well, none. If it's not available, then unless you have personal experience or industry experience that's published through product failures of some sort, then the designer should have no liability exposure. So the more information you now have as the architect, then the more exposure the architect will have with the knowledge that he gains.
Yeah, and this whole question of constructive knowledge, I mean, what is the duty to know or investigate, ties back to the duty. Once you have a duty, then you can't ignore information. So, by way of example, there are undoubtedly cases that are coming down all the time about the law of admiralty. I'm not reading them. I have no idea what they say. And that's okay because I'm not advising about admiralty law. If I undertake to advise on admiralty, then I sure as heck had better be out there researching the law of admiralty and changes in the law of admiralty so that I'm doing my job right.
So as a designer, if there's more and more information out there through HPDs, through Declare, through Theros, and other means, more information is just publicly available about product ingredients. Does that establish an obligation for designers to be aware of that information and the implications of it, whether or not they requested it? Does it basically increase the standard of care for everyone as this trend becomes more widespread?
This is Bart. I guess I wouldn't say it increases your standard of care. As we talked about earlier on in some of the questions, there's this critical mass that needs to be hit, and when there's just a few manufacturers printing this information, I don't think there is as much magnifying glass on that issue. But once there's a critical mass where a lot of industry is doing this, it is part of our responsibility to educate ourselves on the products we specify. And if the mechanism to educate ourselves is additionally reviewing materials such as HPD sheets, then that is another tool that we need to evaluate when we're specifying products.
However, though, Bart,
one of the interesting.
I'm sorry. This is Dick. Even though that is true, how does one establish professional negligence against a designer? One does it by bringing in an expert who then opines as to whether or not the standard of care was breached. And that breach of duty is often an expansion of the state of the art in the science that we're talking about. So the more one finds out about it, the more one is accused of having failed to obtain the information which is readily available. That professional response to actions or failures to act by the designer will come from a professional who will claim that the state of the art is such now with disclosures of information in Pharos and MSDS sheets and similar kinds of Declare and similar websites, that you have a continuing and an expanding duty to obtain this information and act upon it in specification.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think a lot of us have been exposed to cases where we've been told that we breach a standard of care by very other crafty attorneys that have a different definition of what the standard of care is than most normal attorneys would. I guess the key I would always think about is once that critical mass has been met, or once it seems to be a norm amongst the industry when I say that critical mass. These one-offs, these twos-off, does it expose everybody, as the question was asked? It all depends on how the industry is adopting it and how many people are participating in the industry, whether or not that is now part of your normal customary duty to review that information.
And it also ties back to what are you doing and what duties arise out of or relate to what you're doing. So the reason why requiring MSDS sheets to be provided and then not reviewing them and ticking the box and telling the owner, yes, indeed you do, they came in, doesn't give rise to additional, or has not historically given rise to additional liability to the architect, is because the architect has no, and there is no law that consistently applies to the architect, liability for worker safety, because that's somebody else's responsibility. The mere fact of specification, that is to say, requiring by specification, doesn't add duty to the architect in that set of circumstances. But since we're talking about potentially a different class or different group of individuals who may be adversely affected, architects could have or could assume liability associated with this information if it is held, or if it is determined, or if somebody argues for that matter, and they fight long enough to where some architect loses a case sometime, that the presence of that information and a failure to act reasonably in relation to that information injured this other party, this third party.
Brody, I wonder. I think some of the designers out there might want to understand everybody's take on the new protocols for how to represent what we're doing, especially how to represent what we're doing with this information. I can think of all kinds of things that we might tell our clients about this new level of disclosed information that could get us into serious trouble. And there are other ways of dealing with this information that could be more perhaps humble about our capacity for understanding the deep chemistry, or our capacity for doing more than simply using this as a way to sort between different otherwise equal materials with an additional sort of material chemistry. Anyway, the point being, you all, I'm sure, have nightmares about stuff that we could say as designers that would expand our exposure in this. What advice would you be giving us about how to talk about what we're doing with this information?
Well, with the understanding that nobody's giving advice to anybody.
Fine. Thank you. I think of whatever Bones on the the TV show and now movie Star Trek, and his famous line, "I'm a doctor man, not a physicist," or "I'm a doctor man, not an engineer." We are architects. We're not public safety. We're not public health officials. We're architects. We're not medical doctors. We're doctors. We're architects. We're not material science engineers or any of those things. And as architects, we have a limited capacity to do anything really more than take information in that we probably don't understand very well and disclose it to the owner in a way that is just a representation that there is a list out there that says that this particular substance is unhealthy. I don't know if it's unhealthy in any relationship to the context in which you intend to use it. That's a whole other question, which is if the government list says that phthalates are unhealthy if you drink 6 gallons of them every day for the rest of your life, what does that say with respect to their use as a plasticizer in the plastic sheeting on the inside of a building is a very interesting question. But all you really can say is this is a disclosure. The disclosure indicates
that one of the substances in this material is such and such, and you've either asked me to eliminate or to address or to identify such substances or such products that contain such substances. Here are alternatives, and here is the potential economic or other impact associated with a selection of this versus this. What do you think? Maybe the best we can do. I'm still thinking about this, to be candid.
I think that is the best we can do, actually, and maybe even a little more than we need to do. But I don't know. I don't think we can do anything more than that.
Perhaps another way to think of the transfer of liability would be to think of the number of experts that the owner is hiring or that we would request that they hire. We could consider an expansion of that list of owner consultants to include an environmental expert or a chemist or a HPD expert who understands the safety of products as an individual who could be brought in as an owner consultant who could then assume and take upon the responsibility for understanding how these product ingredients act and interact in the design elements and become part of the team which would act to reduce the responsibility of the designers.
That would be a good suggestion, Nick. This is Craig. However, you can just imagine what our clients would say about that. You've got to be kidding me. We've run across at HKS many instances where we recommend specialty consultants just for obvious issues like waterproofing, and clients will say, well, that's what I hired you for. Why would I hire a waterproofer? I recently heard of a case where there was an issue with waterproofing in a building, and that recommendation was made. Client declined to hire the consultant. The architect moved on down the road and handled it himself, like most architects would anyway. And there was a problem in the lawsuit. The lawyer representing the owner said, well, you should have refused to continue providing services when the owner declined to hire that consultant. So you can't predict how ridiculous things are going to get, but I can just imagine the reaction from a client saying, no, I don't think I'm going to hire that person.
Well, and likewise, you can kind of imagine. This is Brody. I'm sorry, I keep not introducing myself. Likewise, you can imagine adding every single possible disclaimer, or exclusion, or exception to your services in relation to HPDs, and how that's going to go over with your marketing folks. Yes, we are going to provide services that are related to the identification of, or the review of HPDs in relation to materials that are going to be, or products that are going to be specified in your project, and we're going to do so in relation to Lead 4. But don't believe a word we say. All we're going to do is just identify whether or not we can tick the box or not tick the box as to the presence or absence of a particular substance, and please sign this contract that has an exclusion of any liability associated with health impacts and a limitation of liability and indemnity going back to me associated with any claim that you see in the future. You could do that. As to whether or not that's going to be something that's going to be saleable is another question.
This is Tristan. So I have a question about that, gets at that issue of interaction between a designer and their client. So as designers learn more information about what's in products, what do you advise that they share actively with clients? And does more active sharing information potentially create more problems if more things are disclosed that maybe could come up down the road? Well, you should have raised more concerns, raised a red flag when you saw that this material was present? Or does making everyone more informed, including the client, sort of spread out that responsibility and spread out that liability so that no one is carrying an undue burden?
Well, this is Bart. I think transparency is a good thing, but as we learn, I guess, the intent is to use this HPD information to inform us relative to product selection. If we're continually requesting that manufacturers post this information on this website, and this website sets up little flags of certain contents, whether or not it meets the certain criteria or not, and we have a product that is on that we requested manufacturers to list, the manufacturer listed it, and then we in turn specify it, it does begin to start opening the door towards liability relative to should we inform the owner that this product is being used on his site. Specifically, if there's a provision that says we will not knowingly specify, or we will not specify any hazardous materials on the job site or in our specifications. So I would say, short answer, it begins to open the door. And now the architectural firms need to figure out how we're going to manage this information internally. What is our if we're asking for this information now, and it's going to be posted out there, and eventually there's going to be a critical mass out there where even if an individual firm might not be asking for it, the industry and the customs and industry are that the information is readily available out there. How are firms going to deal with this information relative to their specifications and their drawings? What information are we going to? How are we going to go about policing ourselves or making the owner informed about certain things that we might have to use, such as that single-ply roof matter that we talked about earlier on, where the solvent had this type of chemical in it that was a problem.
Thank you, Craig, and I'd love for anyone else to jump in and discuss this question. I actually want to turn the conversation over to Russ, and also, Russ, to just maybe answer the question of how you, as a designer at a firm that's actively engaged with APDs, is managing the information. And for people that are out there listening to the call that are saying, there's some things here I should be maybe worried about legally, maybe they're feeling like this isn't worth the trouble right now. What do you say to that? So Russ, are you there and able to take that question, or?
I'm sorry, I was speaking to myself in a muted form, which I'm sure has happened to many of us before. The number of products, building products, for which we have fully disclosed contents is relatively few. So we're climbing the learning curve on this at the moment. What we're doing now is using the information as a way of comparing between products when we can. We would like to, where it's possible, and with the concurrence of our clients, we would like to give preference to people simply who are going to tell us, because we are encouraged by the fact that the industry is moving towards this kind of communication, and we're encouraging manufacturers to participate in it. Obviously, that does not lead us in the direction of making silly recommendations or decisions, but all things being equal, we'd like to support the manufacturers who are engaged in this conversation with us. In time, we will be able to use to compare products on the basis of what's in them and what's not, and we look forward to the literature from places like Building Green and the other places in the industry start to help us in that comparison. We've, of course, As we all learned about VOCs 15 years ago, we relied on a lot of educated press to begin to help us to understand how to use that new information. We will be going into this kind of frame again. But I'm interested in the idea that there are a number of firms. Well, many firms have specifically asked manufacturers, tell us what's in your stuff, in the form of letters. HKS's letter is on their website. Ours is on our website. Perkins & Will has issued one as well. There are a number of firms who are reluctant to ask, I think, feeling that once they ask, they've increased their liability. And I wonder if anybody thinks that that's actually the case, that simply by saying to manufacturers that we'd like to engage in a conversation about the substances in your products, if that really does increase anybody's exposure.
Well, this is Brody. I think the train has left the station. This and a number of folks on the call have already said this. The information is entering the marketplace. It's going to continue to enter the marketplace. It is going to continue to be more available. Consolidators are going to pull information together so that even if you have to, normally research journals in order to figure out whether that information is out there or not, there are going to be folks who are going to be publishing it in a consolidated form. More information, again, does not necessarily give rise to a duty unless the duty exists to do something with that information. But let's take nickel sulfide inclusions in tempered glass. For a while, that it was kind of unknown why it was that tempered glass would spontaneously shatter after a while. But once there was some research done on that topic and it was understood, then it becomes part of the standard of care to, if you're going to use tempered glass in a building, consider either advising the owner or addressing the issue of nickel sulfide inclusion in your specifications. The data doesn't give rise to a duty, but if the duty exists, you can't ignore the data.
So we're getting around to a time when we're going to start to wrap up and take more audience questions. As a way of wrapping up the questions that I prepared for this panel, I'd like to ask each of you what you advise designers at your firm who, or since this isn't actual legal advice, theoretically what you might advise if they want to use disclosure tools, not only perhaps sending out a letter asking for disclosure, but even requiring them as part of submittals and project specifications. What generally do you tell them, and how do you frame it?
Well, this is Craig again. I'll just start. I think my advice here has been when you, first of all, getting the information gives you, as we've discussed in this call, gives you an obligation to do something with it. You can't just ignore it, put it in the file. So then you have to disclose it. You have to clients, if in certain circumstances, that information has to be incorporated in a thought process in the specifications. And if decisions are going to be made about which products to use or specify or not specify, then those conversations need to take place with the client. So, for example, if we learn that a particular product has a substance in it that is considered hazardous and to human beings, then that needs to be discussed with a client and options given, and let the client make a decision about whether or not they want that product and want to spend money to have another product. That's basically where I am.
This is Barstess. I'm on the same page as Craig. If you have knowledge, if you encourage manufacturers to provide information such as these HPD sheets, and you have knowledge that they contain these chemical materials, then we need to keep the owner informed of if we intend on using them, and let the owner make a decision on whether to move forward or not.
That's certainly true. This is Dick. I would adopt the same thought and often have discussions with technical architects about the matter of degree that the relative risk of health and safety bears to the product being specified, because the manufacturer is going to be defending this case from their point of view from a disclosure pinnacle. They're going to describe the fact that they made full disclosure of the information available to them under the state of art in the science in which they practice as to what information they know about and should have known about. That information then finds its way into HPD sheets, MSDS sheets, and other things, and it'll be their defense. What do we tell our technical people when they have this information in their hands? They have to utilize it in a rational way to make a relative risk determination if health and safety becomes an issue, so the client is fully informed. And that issue of relative risk is going to eventually become one of disclosure of the HPD itself, since that is the issue we're describing. And it's analogous somewhat to the way the pharmaceutical industry describes the risk of products that they sell for the relief of various human suffering. And the information sheets that accompany their products are substantially increased in size from what they used to be. Having been in that industry on the defense side for some years in a prior life, I can tell you that the product disclosure sheets that accompany many drugs increased multifold during the time that I worked on them. And the same is likely to be true for the information that becomes part of the specifications process that will be used by designers to make decisions through their technical architects and expertise as to what products are specified. It's a question of relative risk, and it's a question of disclosure, and the element of transparency will become a substantial shield as much as it is a sword for those individuals who are going to claim they were harmed by those products.
Yeah, this is Brody. I don't disagree with anything that's been said, and it's well said. I think that what we're going to continue to need to do is manage expectation and manage contractual undertaking to be reflective of technical capacity. What is it that the architect can do in the protection of the health, safety, and welfare under its licensure, and what its contractual undertakings are to the client. And then to make sure that if the architect is only able to, which it is likely to only be able to, which is disclose the presence of such a substance, that it also discloses what substances, what products are available that do not have those substances in them, and some information to the owner about what the implications of that might be from a design standpoint. That design standpoint may include cost implications.
I think this is Tristan. I think perhaps one of the things that people are grappling with, and I see some of this in the Q&A that's taking place on the call right now, is that an HPD is simply a disclosure. It simply tells you what's in the product, and it doesn't necessarily tell you what to think about it, whether or not something might be a hazard. Everyone's afraid of, you hear the sort of the phrase, the next asbestos sometimes come up. We're all afraid of what the next asbestos is going to be. That's going to lead to a lot of lawsuits. And because these HPDs don't tell us what to think about these product ingredients, but they just tell us what's in it, is there a concern that designers should designers be concerned that they might be getting information now that exposes them to risk down the road because they quote, should have known about something being a new risk or an emerging risk down the road that wasn't identified necessarily at the time. And if anyone wants to jump in on that, and also this sort of question of how we deal with a disclosure of just what's in it versus an assessment. And is there a difference there in how you would advise designers deal with that information?
Well, this is Brody. I think that if information is available and the architect has undertaken a duty contractually or has a duty at law under the application of the standard of care, as Dick has said, that someone may testify about in the future, it's an expert, that the architect has a responsibility because of the existence of that duty to act reasonably in relation to the information. What is reasonable for an architect is very different than what's reasonable for a public health professional. Architects are not going to be required to, or should not be required to, in my estimation, peruse scientific journals or hire somebody to peruse scientific journals to determine what the cutting edge research is on material science as it relates to health impacts. However, to the extent that information is available, the architect is going to have to act reasonably in relation to that information.
Now, if an architect or a design firm says, if they put out a letter requesting HPDs from manufacturers and they state in the letter that the information disclosed in the HPDs will be used to inform their specifications and their product choices, is that potentially taking on more responsibility like that of a public health, a little bit more into that public health professional realm, rather than where some architects might feel more comfortable being?
Well, this is Barstaz. Again, first off, let's think about, has the critical mass been met yet or not, and is it the norm in the industry that an architect should be using this information to inform them? And let's assume it's not yet. But there's the firm out there that's requesting that manufacturers post this information. They specifically say our intent is to use this to help us inform our specifications. Then if they don't, there's always the argument, if something happens, and the argument's going to be, well, you said you were going to, and you didn't. Why didn't you? You were supposed to. That opens the door.
There's also, frankly, a matter of degree involved with this risk analysis. The use of asbestos as an example is a good way to look at this. The number of individuals who contracted mesothelioma, a serious lung condition, as a result of ingestion of asbestos fibers is relatively small compared to those who claim that they are going to contract the disease. Most of these cases were brought by individuals who do not have mesothelioma, but rather they have a fear of developing it at some point in the future, which may or may not be realized. The same is true of many of the products we've been talking about today. The VOC issue, formaldehyde, ethylene glycol, there are numerous products and ingredients and secondary ingredients that can be cited as unsafe in various ways, but it's still a matter of degree, and the number of individuals who are exposed to those who have true injuries is relatively small. So the risk of suit is there always, and the designer is looking to find ways to mitigate or reduce the risk of being involved in suits like that. But the number of individuals who are going to claim a true injury is still relatively small. I don't mean to minimize the fact that there are true injuries involved, but the transparency issue that underlies much of the HPD milieu for describing and obtaining information about products is all a very useful piece of information, and the more that it is disclosed and is utilized by designers, in many respects they will have an ability to be able to show to the owner and to others who may be involved in litigation that this information was known and available, and the transparency then works to our advantage. The number of individuals who are truly involved in litigation in a serious sense is a relatively small number.
So we've reached our time for today. I do want to, if it's okay with the panel, want to keep you on for a couple more minutes because there have been so many questions and comments from our audience, which I've tried to weave in over the last half hour. Now back for just a couple more questions with our panel. I want to there were some comments from the audience just about the intent behind lead before criteria for transparency and HPDs, which is basically the idea. I think it'd be fair to summarize that by urging manufacturers to disclose more information about their products, that just the act of doing that has benefits and will lead them to improve their products and reduce hazards therein, because they won't want to disclose things that don't look good, and just by learning more about what's in their products, they will maybe want to reduce potential hazards. So that represents, so to sort of synthesize some questions and comments that have been here in the Q&A, if that represents sort of the public policy, the lead policy that we've been following for this transparency movement, but as far as individual designers and architects, are we better off using certifications or standards such as cradle to cradle, for example, that give us an answer that say, well, this product is relatively safer than other products because it's been assessed by scientists and it gets a stamp of approval, if you will, from an organization like Cradle to Cradle. Do you as lawyers, do you see certifications that include assessments such as Cradle to Cradle differently than you do disclosures like HPDs?
Well, the Cradle to Cradle analysis is going to still result in it's going to result in information, and that being disseminated, and that information is going to be, with the exception of water and mud, I suppose, and even mud if you eat enough of it, that there is some potential for health impact at some point in time in respect of these substances or products. So I don't know whether that would necessarily, I don't see that as necessarily being particularly more advantageous in terms of mitigating liability, although it does say if the disclosure is wrong, that is to say, if the disclosure of the existence of the material is wrong, that's one thing. If there is a certification or analysis and there's a reliance upon that, and that reliance is reasonable and the certification is incorrect, it does give somebody else, it does put somebody else in the firing line, but only in the event of that error, it seems to me.
If the question goes into regulation, there are also certain mitigating standards there as well. There are organizations such as ASHRAE or ANSI or UL that are producing various types of standards that often overlap with specification in a very meaningful way and describe the products with some specificity. And there are many of those that designers are using that have off-gassing issues and other health-related concerns such as various types of foam that are used for building insulation on exterior wall systems. There have been a number of cities that have undertaken studies to show that the off-gassing and the health concerns for individuals who might be exposed to those products in their living quarters or work quarters is a safety issue. And specification of that as it overlaps with regulation is something that designers are going to have to be watching with particular interest as more information is made available as to the types of ingredients and product disclosures that are in those types of systems.
Thank you. And I'm going to just close with one final question, and I hope if everyone on the panel, thank you all, Bart, Brody, Craig, Dick, Russ, thank you all for joining us. And if you could all just chime in on maybe this one last question. This trend around transparency and disclosure, it just seems to have taken on a life of its own. The legal climate around product specification and design may also, just be changing as a result of that going forward, whether or not we like it, whether or not individual designers choose to engage in that. So if it's happening anyway, how would you say we can be smart about engaging with it and keeping in mind that there are good environmental and health reasons for this trend to be happening? We don't want to necessarily get in the way. How can we be smart about seeing this go forward?
Well, I'll jump in. This is Russ from the designer's perspective. Many of us have been trying to get this information for a long, long time, and we're now just starting to get it. So I think it is incumbent upon us to do our homework and to understand what it is that we're seeing and what it means, and to be aware of what will be a new body of literature that will come out about this. We certainly have people in most of our offices who are experts on all kinds of things about buildings and materials, and those of us who have spent the time to get as far as we have on material chemistry are going to have a lot more work to do.
And this is Brody. I think that, and again, not that I don't want to cast any aspersions at all towards any other member of any other profession, but this is hardly the same ilk as the tobacco industry and its bad history in terms of disclosing information or having information and then not disclosing information regarding the health impacts of tobacco products. The architectural community is in many ways at the cutting edge of sustainability, and sustainability is a broad concept. It's one that includes human health and environmental health. So the fact that this is happening, the fact that this is being driven by architects is unsurprising. Architects are committed to transparency and then right thinking. It's just a question of what, as architects, with the capacity that we possess as architects to know and act upon information, can we do in order to make it really clear that we're acting within the full scope of that capacity and not within a capacity that is just going to give rise to liability because we really don't know what we're talking about.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel have some final thoughts?
Certainly the interaction of the designer with the built environment and the health and safety environment in structures is something that is gaining much more visibility through the disclosure of this information and through the green movement in general terms. The drive to have buildings obtain a LEED or other similar standard is one which takes into account a variety of products and systems which interact very specifically with the human beings that occupy those structures. It behooves the architect to, as it was just described by Russ, to be in the forefront of the movement to understand how these systems interact and to take those steps necessary to allow them to be habitable in the true sense of the word.
Yeah, this is Craig, and I would just say, or just add that the law would require that once a person undertakes to provide a service, then that undertaking needs to be made with due care without being negligent. So what that means to me is that if an architecture firm, an architect, starts down the road of dealing with HPDs and this issue, then you can't just do it halfway. You've got to go all the way and develop the skills, the knowledge, and carry forward that way.
Well, thank you very much. I think unless anyone has any final comment, that'll conclude our event for today. I want to thank our very distinguished panel, Bart Stassa, Brody Stevens, Craig Williams, Richard Victoria, Russell Perry, and myself, Tristan Roberts. I want to thank our audience for attending and the very engaged online Q&A we've had during the session. So once again, and you will, this was recorded. We will offer a recording to anyone that came, and we will continue to engage this issue through online forums and other mediums through Building Green's offerings, as well as with our partners and collaborators. A big special thanks to Russell Perry for helping put this event together, and again, thank you to our panel and our audience. Have a great day.